Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, and welcome to Aberdeenshire, our new broadcasting centre, for the time being at least. In today's show, we ask the question whether a 700-year-old letter could hold the key to the future of Scotland.
For as long as 100 of us remain alive, never will we, on any conditions, be subjected to the lordship of the English. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself.
That's how Hollywood star Brian Cox, a great friend of this programme, delivers the most famous lines from the Declaration of Arbroath, which is a subject matter of a brand new film from Leslie Riddoch, Charlie Stewart and the composer Patrick Doyle. In this programme, we look at the history, the cultural significance and the political impact of Scotland's very own Independence Declaration. But now first to your tweets, your emails and your messages. And first up is Terry, who's commenting on the series in Northern Ireland, one of which shows had a viewership of over 500,000 on Facebook. Terry said, "Another great show. You're shining a light on the complex situation in Northern Ireland. Fascinating indeed." And Mike Fabian, on similar lines, talks about the interview with Mike Nesbitt, the member of the Northern Irish Assembly, calling it fascinating and insightful. Gordon Ross says, "As an enjoyable discussion, a good Irish speaker." There was one or two good Irish speakers there, Gordon. And Maureen Ferguson, "Educate the young, that's the future." And Wendy Graham Gordon says, "Jesus' commandments, love your neighbour as I have loved you." She's talking about the shows in Northern Ireland, but that's something that could be generally applicable, particularly in dreadful times like the present, Wendy. And then Fiona Graham writes in about the show about Yvonne Ridley, the lady who shot to international prominence when she was captured by the Taliban. She says, "What a fascinating interview of Yvonne Ridley." And Taras Gal says, "I thought so too. She's an amazing lady. I was impressed by how she coped with being arrested by the Taliban." And Robert Wadley, in the similar lines, says, "Enjoyed the interview immensely. Ridley's life story and work are truly remarkable." You're absolutely right, Robert. She's a very remarkable lady indeed. And now to the Declaration of Arbroath. I've asked Professor Ted Cowan from his home in the southwest of Scotland to let us understand some of the real historical significance behind that 700-year-old document. Ted Cowan, tell us what was going on when this Declaration of Arbroath, or this letter to the Pope, was written. What was happening in 1320 that inspired the Declaration?
Well, I think the major issue is that what was not happening, because Robert Bruce had been around for a long time fighting for the kingship. He had won a huge victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, and that battle was so colossal that it should have brought him whatever he wanted, because he defeated the English wholeheartedly. However, the King of England, Edward II, at the time, refused really to recognise Bruce's right to be regarded as King of Scots. And in his desperation, Bruce arranged for this letter to be sent to the Pope in Avignon, saying, "Put some heat on Edward in England to get him to recognise my title."
So was it, in effect, a medieval PR pamphlet for the Bruce family, a kind of round robin to back them up?
Well, I think it was two things. Of course, anything that would support the Bruce family was essential to Bruce himself. But on the other side, I think Bruce had quite higher aspirations. I mean, what he was trying to do after the difficulties of the past, and remember, this had been going on since 1286, and after these difficulties, what he wanted to do was to think about what would be the best kind of kingdom for himself to create. And out of that came some of the rhetoric that appears in the Declaration.
Now, the language is beautiful in the Declaration, attributed to Bernard de Linton, the Chancellor of Scotland, the Abbot of Arbroath. But I mean, it's extraordinary, the power and the clearness of thought that comes through. How do you explain that?
Well, one explanation is that when you were writing to the Pope in this period, you had to use the papal cursus. And the papal cursus means a kind of fancy way of writing. You had to write in a way that would keep... The Pope is listening to umpteen petitions every day. He's falling asleep. So what do you want to do? You want to say things that are going to waken him up and think, hey, that's a bright idea. I never heard that uttered before, least of all from somebody in a remote place like Scotland.
And how important was, almost the preliminaries of the document, saying, listen, the Scots have been here for a long time. We're an unconquered people. Our lineage and history is greater than that of the English. Is that very much part of the medieval mind?
That's part of the propaganda, anyway. And one can see that it's a bright idea. The legend, the other legends in Scotland were about Scota, the daughter of Pharaoh. That again suggested the Scots went way back in time. The Picts were supposed to be descended from other ancient peoples, probably around the time of Christ or maybe even earlier. So it's great propaganda to say that, yeah, they're specially chosen by God. And because their patron saint was Andrew, and Andrew was the first of the disciples to meet Christ, that was also good publicity as far as Bruce was concerned.
Now, Ted, we're going to have a look specifically at two of the concepts in the Declaration to get your interpretation of them. Firstly, there's this phrase which basically looks like something from John the Divine, where said all people are created equal, whether they be Greek or Jew or Scots or English. This is quite an unusual concept, is it not, for a medieval document? I mean, were the Scots as altruistic and looking at, or was this part of the propaganda game?
Well, it could be part of the propaganda game, of course. And I wouldn't think the Scots are any more altruistic than anybody else. But what he's actually trying to do here is to shame the Pope into saying, listen, Pope, you are responsible for this violence. You are responsible for not helping us out in our time of war with the English. And all are created equal in that sense. You just have just as much responsibility for the welfare of the Scots as for the English or the French or anybody else.
And let's have a look at the second and probably the most interesting concept of all in the document. Let's have a listen to it.
Yet if Lord Robert should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own right and ours, and make some other man who is well able to defend us our king.
So in many ways, this is the biggie in the document. This is the reference which seems to suggest some form of contractual government or even popular sovereignty, which a very, very modern concept. Was Bernard de Winton, hundreds of years before anyone else, actually pointing the way to the modern concepts of democracy?
Well, it sounds impossible, but, that something like this should arise in a wee country in the north beyond which there is no dwelling place at all, as the document says. But I believe, and this is the first time that we have an actually explicit reference to the contractual theory of monarchy, if you will, in anywhere at all. It is a great moment, this, in Scottish history. I think it's the beginning of the sovereignty of the people. And I think that there's some evidence to back that up. But it's in its own right. It's a tremendous thing. There was a lot of Scots trying to work out the question of where did ultimate sovereignty in the church lie? Was it the papacy? Was it the cardinals? Was it the people? Where was it? And I think that some of this comes out in this idea of popular sovereignty that Bruce is suggesting.
And how would you rate, Professor Cowan, this document in terms of world or European importance first, or world importance? Should it be right up there with some of the great declarations through history? I
think it should be. And for that reason, I think it's very good that it's now on the UNESCO list of absolutely crucial documents. that's exactly where it belongs. I wouldn't want to claim that this had a huge influence on the rest of Europe, but you never know. We in the medieval period, we have so little to go on that you have to really squeeze as much information as you can out of whatever references you actually have.
Now, Professor Cowan, it's quite extraordinary that this 700th anniversary was going to be the centrepiece of modern demonstrations for Scottish independence. Presumably they'll now take place next year, God willing. But how quickly has the idea behind the Declaration gathered pace over the last few years? Is this something that's come out of the blue or something that's been gaining ground for a while?
Well, it has been gaining ground for quite a bit. It was a big turning point for it was, I think, the first appearance and the first translation into English of the document in 1689 at the Glorious Revolution. And after that, the breakthrough, I think, came in 1970, when there was quite an interest in the whole thing, and you will remember that yourself, of events that were taking place around that. And things have grown since then in quite a big way, for good or ill, to the States and Canada and all over the place.
But then, of course, it was encapsulated in a US Senate resolution, and there has to be said that there's quite a feather in the cap of Scotland for the US Senate to look upon the Declaration of Arbroath as an inspiration for the Declaration of American Independence.
It was remarkable. And I think you and I were both in Washington at the time when the first of these celebrations took place, with Scot of the Year and all the rest of it, and the unbelieving press over here in Scotland who thought this was a lot of nonsense. Senator Trent Lott, the majority senator at Washington, and of course the influence, by the way, of a movie called Braveheart by one Mel Gibson.
How do you think the community of the realm of 1320 would have regarded the impact that their letter is having today?
I think they would have been very happy at that notion that this was being quoted, but then we must recall that they were talking about human universals. For so long as 100 of us remain alive, we shall never surrender. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we're fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest person will lose, but with life itself. Nobody can really argue with that statement. It's an appeal to freedom. It's an appeal to inclusion. It's an appeal which dazzles. And I think that's the important point here. It's something that appeals worldwide.
Professor Ted Cowan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Join us after the break when we talk to the singer Sheena Wellington, the lady who electrified the opening of the Scottish Parliament by singing Robert Burns back in 1999, about the cultural significance of the Declaration of Arbroath, and to Billy Kay, the commentator, about why it's still having an impact in modern politics in Scotland. Join us then. Welcome back. Now that we've established the historical significance of the Declaration of Arbroath, what did it mean to Scottish culture? I spoke to Sheena Wellington on the phone from her home in Dundee. Sheena Wellington, you famously sang Burns, Robert Burns, to the opening of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. I want to ask you, how big an impact did the Declaration of Arbroath and the whole period of Bruce and Wallace have in the folk and cultural revival in Scotland in the 1960s and 70s?
I think it was actually stronger than people give it credit for. I think there was a sense of growing identity in what you might call the war babies as they came of age. And there were lots of things happening, including Polaris and a kind of feeling that Scotland had a government at that time, which had been elected in 1959, where they voted for. And I think there was a sense that it was time we stood up and made our views known.
So it's quite an interesting phenomenon, obviously, because Scottish history was starting to study the Declaration of Arbroath, the period of the Wars of Independence, very seriously. Scottish politics was starting to change with the initial rise of the SNP in the 1960s. And feeding into that is a cultural and folk music revival. It seems strange for our international audience that you could sing songs about this period and it'd be recognisable to the people crowding into the bars and taverns to listen to folk acts. But that was the case, wasn't it?
It was really. And what we found, I think what was found in the folk revival was this sense that we did have a culture which was not the hands clasped tightly below the bosom, let's sound very pretty, which was what we've been presented with heretofore. There was a kind of rough-edged Scottish smedum that had come from years past, had always been there.
And so, Sheena Wellington, when you were part of that great folk music and cultural revival of the 1970s in Scotland, did you ever for 1 second think you would end up singing in front of the dignitaries and new elected members of a reconvened Scottish Parliament in 1999?
Well, a Scottish Parliament was a dream that we all had, I think. And I never thought I would actually end up singing there. But it was a great boost to the self-confidence of, I think, the cultural scene in Scotland. And it was a tremendous honour for me.
Sheena Wellington in Dundee, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let us pray that come it may, as come it will for all.
So the Arbroath Declaration has been very important for the revival of Scottish history. It's been important for the great cultural revival in Scotland in the 1970s and onwards. But can it really still have political significance? I spoke to Billy Kay, who's just done a series on BBC Sounds on the Declaration of Arbroath. Billy Kay, can we really say that a 700-year-old document is still having an impact on modern Scotland?
Absolutely. It's one of the foundations of the nation. It's called The Pedigree of a Nation by one of the historians, and it still has tremendous significance. This is the 700th anniversary, on the 650th anniversary, which coincided with the first wave of modern Scottish nationalism, you could say. The establishment at that time was so scared of the Declaration of Arbroath that they tried to play down the celebrations of it. And there's a famous incident during the celebration when the Secretary of State for Scotland, Willie Ross, was doing a reading, and a famous Scottish nationalist, Wendy Wood, stood up at the ceremony and shouted out, "Hypocrites," much to applause from the nationalists in the audience. At the same event, you had people heckling the ceremony who were loyalists and unionists. Some things never change in Scottish society. I think they had an objection to the fact that it was a letter to the Pope. And throughout that period, it began to take on significance, and it began to be recognised and as an important document to modern nationalists. There's a song from that period which went, "Here's to the men who took the oath, the Declaration of Arbroath. Freedom and right, our cause is both, no English subjugation." So for modern nationalism, it rung bells because it was an international document. It was steeped in European history. And Scotland's always reached out to Europe in that way. So it ties in with nationalism and internationalism.
But okay, perhaps you can explain something to our international audience. I mean, with people watching this in America who will know that the American Senate incorporated April the 6th, Tartan Day, because that was the date of the sealing of the Declaration of Arbroath. But many people in Scotland would poo-poo the idea that the Declaration of Arbroath was an inspiration for the Declaration of Independence in America. How can it be that people in America think that, but many people in Scotland tend to run down that idea?
Well, this is the actual Senate resolution. April 6 has a special significance for all Americans, and especially those Americans of Scottish descent, because the Declaration of Arbroath, the Scottish Declaration of Independence, was signed on April 6, 1320, and the American Declaration of Independence was modelled on that inspirational document. That's good enough for me, Alec, but in the period that the American Declaration was signed, there was a huge Scottish influence in American society. All of the universities, like Princeton College was a Presbyterian college funded by money from Scotland. Its principal, Witherspoon, signed the American Declaration of Independence. Others like James Wilson signed it. These men were steeped in the books and the works of the Scottish Enlightenment, so they would be aware of the Declaration of Arbroath.
It's a medieval document, obviously, but it does have some very modern concepts. It at least it tilts its cap at the idea of contractual government or perhaps even popular sovereignty. It rings through that the equality among nations is something that international authority in 1320 of the Pope John the 22nd, of course, now the United Nations it would be. These are very modern concepts. It is an extraordinary thing. Now, in your studies, have you found any other medieval documents in Europe which point to the same sort of emerging concepts?
I don't think so. I think it was unique in that. Now, there were certain political things going on at the time, which also make you understand that concept. For example, the English had another Balliol in the wings, the son of John Balliol, and they were desperate for him to overtake Bruce. So that clause about getting rid of any king if he didn't support their independence was also directed at the English and John Balliol. If you force another king upon us, we'll get rid of him too. So there's that. But I think there always has been an egalitarian principle in Scottish intellectual history. He was the King of Scots, not the King of Scotland. So I think we've imbued and we've imbibed that throughout our history. And this is really the beginning of it, this concept of the community of the realm. We're all Jock Tamson's bairns, a man's a man for all that. And some people would say I'm being romantic, but there it is in black and white in 1320, and let's celebrate that.
Just a matter of interest. I mean, how long did it take the Declaration to get to Avignon and the papacy? I mean, there was no email in these days, so I assume it went by boat and by a fast horse once it got to France. Would that be the sort of logic of it?
It would have been taken by ship and then overland, and it would have taken several weeks to get there, then several weeks to respond. So it was a very, very slow process. In my programme, there's a lovely sequence by Alexander McCall Smith from one of his Scotland Street novels, where someone recognises the Declaration of Arbroath. And the character in the novel says, I'm sure the Pope didn't get very many letters from Arbroath. And so, yes, it's got this international resonance, it's got a historic resonance, but it's also part of our history today. I mean, Tartan Day is being celebrated today in New York. I was there last year, and it's been celebrated. That's the thing about the Declaration. For example, there's a wonderful story with a Russian connection or a Russian language connection in my programme, where Becky Smith, who wrote a book about the Jacobites in Russia, was hiking in the North Caucasus Mountains with her family. This is a few years ago, 2014. And the border guards shout in Russian to her, where are you from? And she replies in Russian, we're from Scotland. The family were invited in behind the razor wire and began a conversation. The guards gave them something to drink and gave them something to eat. And to Becky's astonishment, the border guard quoted the famous lines from the Declaration of Arbroath. He was a Georgian. He identified with Scotland because Scotland, like Georgia, had a large neighbour which was always and Scotland and Georgia were always looking over their shoulder at that larger neighbour. And it's such a poignant story. And it shows that, even in the North Caucasus Mountains, a soldier, can quote from the Declaration of Arbroath.
Now, of course, if it hadn't been overtaken by the global emergency, then there was going to be a huge rally this week in Arbroath with the modern independence marchers proclaiming the Declaration as a source of their inspiration. Do you think that when the world gets back onto its axis, that we're going to see that sort of connection between this historic document and the push for independence in the Scotland of today?
Absolutely. All of these celebrations are postponed. They're going to happen. I was due to take part in a concert on Saturday, which involved Sheena Wellington and involved a band called Arbroath and Ali Heather and various people who were celebrating the declaration of Arbroath. And that will go ahead now on the 701st anniversary. And it should do, because it's such an important, iconic document in Scottish history. It would have been tragic if it wasn't celebrated. But fortunately, through Leslie Riddoch's fine film and through my 3-part radio documentary, at least people can access this document and realise what it meant to Scotland and what it's meant to the world.
And lastly, Billy Kay, the community of the realm back in 1320, this phrase which seems to go beyond the usual feudal hierarchy, how would the community of the realm have thought if they thought that 700 years later the cause of Scottish independence was still being promulgated and people were looking back to their declaration? How would that have made them feel?
I think they would have said, go in your cell, hod for it, hod gone, keep the flame alive and make sure you win it back again.
Billy Kay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Declaration of Arbroath is 700 years old. It is a medieval document. It was sealed, not signed. It wasn't emailed to Avignon. It went by ship and by horse and took weeks to get there. But for all it's an ancient document, it's very modern in its concept. Firstly, it's sophisticated. All the stuff about the history of the Scots, that's there for a purpose. That's to establish the credentials of Scotland. Got here before the English, according to the Declaration. The language is learned. It tilts a cap at the Roman historian Sallust. It quotes from St. John the Divine that all people are created equal. It reminds the Pope that that should be the case. These are interesting concepts. But even more interesting is two things about the document. Firstly, it seems to go beyond the usual feudal medieval caste list of the barons, the nobles, good King Robert, the clergy who wrote the document. It talks about something called the community of the realm. And if the community of the realm can't be the feudal caste list, so it has to be something else. It's a sort of embracing that there's something beyond that. There's something which we currently term the people. And then, most revolutionary of all, it suggests what the people, the community of the realm, might do if good Lord Robert doesn't come up to snuff and doesn't fulfil what he's meant to do, doesn't protect Scotland against the English, then they'll get rid of him and get someone else in. Now that seems to be some sort of look at a contractual relationship between the government and the governed, or what we might term in modern days popular sovereignty. Now that is a concept which in the modern world has decided the fate of nations. It's a concept which might still decide the fate of Scotland. So from Taz and myself and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, and we'll see you next week.
Scots wha hae wi Wallace bled, Scots wha Bruce has oft times led, welcome to your gory bed, or to victory.